What's going on, guys? This is Alvin with Alvin Teaches Poker. Just got a brand new webcam and I wanted to play with it. It's pretty fun, have this weird screen removal thing going on so I can't see the background, but if I go too far back, oh god, Thanos got me and now I'm back. So what's going on, everyone? Today we are going to be talking about the dreaded double pot overbet on the turn, which is always one of those situations that makes my head explode when I face it, so I know that if I'm going to be using it, it's going to make my villains' heads explode, and usually when people have exploded heads, they're not very good at playing strategic card games. Before we go on to the analysis, please like and subscribe to this channel. It really helps out. If you're interested in seeing all of the wonderful simplifications that I've been playing with myself and the ones that my students have been using to crush cash games, please check out my website at overnightmonster.com. That's how I pay the bills, besides, playing poker. Let's take a look at a common situation in Piosolver. So in the example, the cutoff RFIs to 2.5 big blinds and then the button flats. So in a low rate game, I think the cutoff's going to be opening between 25 and 30% of the time, depending on how passive it thinks the button actually is. And here on the button, we're going to be defending with a somewhat uncapped range in the fact that we have ace queen offsuit and jacks pre-flop, but we're generally going to be mixing almost all of these hands with either 3-bets or folds. So a hand like ace jack is going to be a flat like 0.4% of the time, and then a 3-bet 0.6% of the time, but a hand like pocket deuces is actually going to be flatting like 25% of the time and then folding 75% of the time. There might be a couple of percentages of a 3-bet here, but generally a lot of the hands in this flatting range are going to be mixed strategies between calls and 3-bets and then calls and folds. So the flop comes king jack 7, which is traditionally a good board for the pre-flop raiser, and indeed if we look at the out of position here, we can see that we have $32 of equity in a $65 pot, and considering that we only invested $25 pre-flop, clearly we're going to be making $7 every time this board comes. So also notice that despite having a disadvantage post-flop, because the rake is so low, the button actually is going to make more than he initially contributed to the pot. So initially the button put in $25 after he made that pre-flop call, but he's getting $28 back. So this is a situation where, because the rake is not taking an extraordinary amount of money from the pot, both the raiser and the caller are actually going to show a profit here, which is something that you do not see at, say, 1-3 live at a casino. In those situations, both players will often lose money, and sometimes both players will lose so much money that it is impossible for either one of them to profit unless one of them is so bad and is just dumping money to the other. Despite this flop being so good for the pre-flop raiser, it's just not a board where you actually can range bet. Here, if we look at what the optimal strategy is, you can see that Pio wants to check nearly 63% of the time. So despite this being a board where we're going to have all kings, jacks, and sevens, because it's a little bit coordinated, because our opponent has a much narrower range than us, and they have some jacks and some sevens, this is not a spot where we can just close our eyes and bet 1/3. And so often you're going to have to start this flop with a check. In a previous video, which I link above, I demonstrate a method for picking your out of position continuation bets where you do some checking and some betting with your strongest hands as well as a variety of bluffs to get into the ballpark of like 20 to 25% c-bet frequency. Here you can see that with a 36% c-bet frequency, this is probably a spot where if you simplified to my out of position heuristic, you're going to get extremely close to GTO's EV. Even though that's something we're not going to test in this video, it's something that you can go ahead and test on your own if you have GTO Plus or Piosolver. I recommend Piosolver. So let's start with a check. And then, because this board is indeed good for the pre-flop raiser, our opponent actually shouldn't be betting the majority of the time, but when they do have an option between checking and betting, they're generally going to err on the larger side on this kind of drawy coordinated board, particularly when we should still be able to have some combinations of jacks and sevens, and we are indeed incentivized to play a very large pot. However, our opponent is still going to be checking the majority of the time. So after we check, which is a majority action, and our opponent checks in the majority action, we're going to now see a turn. First, let's actually consider what each player's EV is before each action. So before we even make any actions on the flop, our out of position EV is about $32 and the in position EV is $28. However, after I check and now split my range, you can see that my EV is $28 and the in-position EV is now $32. So this is a spot where, because I've checked the majority of my hands that have like 45% equity in this pot, indeed my equity after I check is going to reflect that my range is a little bit weaker than my initial starting range. This should make much sense, but also notice that my out-of-position EV doesn't plummet because I have combinations of kings, jack sevens, jack 10, etc., which are still going to be able to give me a resilient check calling and check raising range. So now here our opponent checks again. What does this say about the relationship between our two EVs? Now the out of position player, their EV increases to higher than their initial EV. So after I check and my opponent checks, despite both of us still having some combinations of nuts in both of our ranges, after I check, my opponent should be checking back jacks with some frequency, a little bit of king jack with some frequency, although he should probably always bet sevens. It seems that with my entire range, I'm going to just have much more stronger hands that are going to very happily want to play for 2 or even 3 more streets of value, despite there only being 2 streets of betting left. This is where the overbet comes in. So the turn is the 2 of clubs, and though this board is not fantastic for us, notice that when choosing between 2 sizings, between 2/3 and double the pot, we actually are going to be wanting to bet double the pot more often. That's pretty crazy. If we go into the runouts comparison, we can see that for the out of position player, we actually should be overbetting on quite a few boards. An ace, a king, a 7, and all of the low cards, except ones that bring in the spade, all seem to be pretty good candidates to go ahead and put in an overbet. The boards that you really don't want to put in overbets are generally going to be like the queen, jack, 10, and 9 high boards that are going to bring in a lot of your opponent's gut shot draws, which should also compose the majority of your opponent's flop checking back range. They should probably be checking back a lot of gut shots with no spade, etc. So basically, when the turn can come really good for your opponent after they check back, you don't want to have an overbetting range, but when they check back and the turn always comes really good for you, yeah, probably a time to just put in the large sizing. And as you can see on an ace high flop, though we're not betting very often because our opponent should have a lot of aces in their checking back range on the flop, when we do bet, we're going to just want to pound it because we exclusively should have ace-king, ace-jack, aces, and probably more combinations of queen-10 on the turn by our opponent, though that's not always going to be clear depending on who you're playing. So here, when we reach the turn, we can see our out-of-position equity is 35, our in-position opponents is 25, and so because we have a very large equity advantage here, we can go ahead and just begin to push the action. This is not always going to be the case, and there's going to be a lot of boards where we actually cannot overbet even after our opponent checks back. So we've rerun this simulation, so now it's the cutoff opens to 2.5 big blinds, the button flats, and now the flop comes jack 7-7. So before we take any actions, if we check our out-of-position equity, we can see that it's about $32 and the in-position equity is about 28. So this is definitely a board that still favors us as the pre-flop raiser, even though it's not going to necessarily be as clear who has the distinct nuts advantages. It's kind of murky who has more sevens, between the cutoff opener having probably more raw combinations of 7x in his opening range, but the pre-flop caller probably having a narrower width of range, and so proportionally might have more sevens. And as you can see, the equities are going to run pretty close, although the out-of-position equity is going to be higher, because as the uncapped pre-flop raiser, he's got aces, kings, and queens, etc. So after you check, your EV falls to 25 and your opponent's rises to 35. So definitely notice that when you check on these boards, your EV falls more than if the board was like king, jack, 7, where you can be checking combinations of the effective nuts more often. After your opponent checks, and let's pick a turn that is a real blank. So let's say the 3 of diamonds, which gives no backdoors. Here, now, when we have to choose between dupe bet sizes, we can clearly see, in general, we should be betting the 2/3 sizing instead of the overbet, even though we definitely can add an overbet into our range and then try to merge everything around that overbet. One of the big reasons why we should not be overbetting as, say, a default is that when we look at our opponent's range when we check to him, Though he doesn't ever check back any of his 7x, he definitely seems to be checking back a variety of his Jack-X type hands, and he checks back all of these kind of lower pairs that can turn a set. So very often on these trips possible boards, when your opponent checks, they're actually going to have board coverage for a lot of different sets on the turn, which means that you cannot automatically begin to blast. You probably can blast a little bit more when the turn comes an ace, a king, or a queen, because you have top set in all of those scenarios. But in general, if the turn comes between a 10 and a 2, probably something where you're going to want to pick kind of a normal sizing. So you definitely have to respect your opponent's board coverage on the turn, even when they have almost no combinations of slow plays of trips on the flop. It seems that after being checked to, the in-position player should go ahead and bet small with the majority of their range, and because they want to use this small sizing, they also need to put a lot of combinations of the nuts in there in order to balance these random bluffs or thin value hands like pocket nines or pocket eights. Here, as we can see when we run the hotness comparison, indeed aces, kings, and queens seem to be the turns that are most favorable for us to overbet, and in general we should just be checking or betting small on the majority of these other boards. So hopefully this gives you some ideas about spots where you should be developing an overbet range that maybe you're not incorporating into your game right now. And though I haven't given you the exact combinations of hands which you should be overbetting, you can generally presume that your stronger hands are going to be put into your overbet range, and then there's going to be some balancing range around that. And so I'll leave it up to you to figure out how to exactly formulate those ranges. If you enjoyed this, again, please like and subscribe. And in my next video, I'll be talking about why some pre-flop ranges I've seen from Jonathan Little's site make me think that he has absolutely no idea what he's talking about at all. Facts.